Uh, Good evening, good afternoon. Welcome everybody to another event that's hosted by the Issam Fares Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs. We're pleased today to have a slightly unusual event. It's a book launch and a panel discussion on this very interesting book that has just been published called Lebanon After the Cedar Revolution. There are copies for sale, and it's available in local bookshops. And we're fortunate to have the two editors, Are Knudsen and Michael Kerr, and two of the authors of the various chapters, Sari Hanafi and Nasser Yassin, who are both professors at AUB, and Michael Young, who will be the commentator at the end. Michael is a very distinguished commentator, well known in Lebanon, and has written his own book on Lebanon called The Ghosts of Martyrs Square, an eyewitness account of Lebanon's life struggle, which I recommend very highly for anybody who wants to understand the intricacies and nuances of Lebanese life and politics. Are Knudsen is a senior researcher at the Christian Michelsen Institute in Bergen, Norway. Michael Kerr is professor of conflict studies and Middle East and Mediterranean studies at King's College London. Sari Hanafi is professor of sociology and chair of the Department of Sociology, Anthropology, and Media Studies at AUB. And Nasser Yassin is assistant professor at the Faculty of Health Sciences, and he's the research director of our Issam Fares Institute program of policy and governance in Palestinian refugee camps. So thank you all for coming, and thanks to the five speakers. We're going to give the two editors 10 minutes each to talk about the book and why they did it, why they think it's relevant and useful, and point out some of the most interesting parts or the relevant parts that they want to point out. And then the two chapter authors will each speak briefly for 7 minutes each about their chapter, and then Michael will have 10 minutes at the end to give his commentary, and then we'll open it up for discussion. So thank you, everybody. And Ara, you can start.
Thank you, Ronnie. It's my pleasure to begin by thanking the Issam Fares Institute for the opportunity to present this book and debate some of its findings. I would also like to thank the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, whose program on peace and reconciliation funded the project and workshop that led to this book. And of course, they bear no responsibility for the views or analysis presented in it. There are several books on Lebanon, that the Civil War and the post-Civil War period, and most recently, the books that charts Rafik Hariri's career and demise, such as Michael Young's The Ghosts of the Martyrs Square and Nicholas Blanford's Killing Mr. Lebanon. This is the first book to tackle the post-Hariri period, with most of the chapters focusing on the crucial years after 2005. Yet post is not a good term, because Hariri's legacy is strongly felt. And as I will come back to later, this book includes several chapters examining his career and legacy. The second and broader question is how Lebanon fared after the Cedar Revolution, the first mass demonstrations to rock the Middle East. What came of it? And what, if anything, changed after the lights were turned off and the flags came down in the Martyrs Square's independence camp? There are, broadly speaking, two views of Lebanon's historical predicament. A cyclical one, claiming that Lebanon suffers from an endless repetition of its internal problems, leading to conflict and new civil wars. Opposed to this, there is what one could call an evolutionary view that sees changes both to the country's internal conflict dynamics and to the forms and types of foreign interventions. Now, what exactly were these changes? In the introduction to the book, we highlight some of the new governance and power-sharing issues that took effect from 2005. I will now present some of them in a very brief headline style. The first, internationalization. There has been an internationalization of internal conflict since 2005. This has been made possible by a rare convergence of like-minded Western countries, US, UK, and France, which has permanent, sorry, you have a serious problem with this one. I think your turn. Thank you. Which as permanent members of the Security Council has increased the UN's leverage in Lebanon by issuing several UN Security Council resolutions targeting Lebanon, setting up supranational institutions like the Special Tribunal for Lebanon, as well as expanded the UN peacekeeping in the south after the 2006 war. Also, the EU's presence is more strongly felt through its European neighborhood policy. Taken together, this means that Lebanon is strongly influenced by different forms of foreign intervention aiming to stabilize or destabilize the country depending on one's perspective. This internationalization means that ending conflict through the traditional elite deals is no longer possible, or at least has become more difficult. And at the same time, there is less willingness to compromise, as shown by the defunct national dialogue talks that have been put on hold. Number 2, stable political blocs. Since 2005, there have been 2 relatively stable bloc formations in Lebanese politics. The 8 March and 14 March are not simply labels, but signifiers of a deep internal political divide attached to foreign countries and sponsors. The Sunnis and Shias fall neatly into either category. The Maronites are divided between them, and the Druze shifting between the two. These blocs, we argue, have made Lebanon almost ungovernable. Unity governments. Since 2005, Lebanon has been governed by so-called unity governments, but they are in reality anything but unitary. They bring political adversaries into cabinet to form government, which is why they struggle for months over their ministerial statements and fail to take necessary action on everyday policy issues, not to mention divisive political issues which remain unsolved. Minority veto. The last-ditch resort to stop a cabinet decision is to veto it. Minority veto is a new power-sharing mechanism taking effect from 2008, when, following the Doha Agreement, a new formula for sharing cabinet seats was adopted, granting the minority a blocking third of the cabinet seats. While protecting the minority's concerns, it leads to lengthy cabinet and government deadlocks that is often displaced to the street as street protests or riots. Battle for control of the state. Number 5. The Syrian troop withdrawal in mid-2005 led to a power vacuum that increased the importance of gaining control of the Lebanese state. Both the Future Movement and its main rival Hezbollah battle for control of the state to protect vital security interests. This is even more acute due to mutual lack of trust and security guarantees. The current problems with agreeing to a new electoral law are an indication of the importance of winning elections and form government and thereby control state institutions. Number 6, judicialization. There is a judicialization of internal conflict whereby the Special Tribunal for Lebanon turns political conflict into a judicial issue. Of course, many will also claim the opposite, that the STL politicizes justice. The tribunal also bureaucratizes internal conflict in a new way. The Memorandum of Understanding signed by the Senora government is inescapable. Subsequent governments, like Mikate's, cannot afford to default on its obligations vis-à-vis the tribunal. In the end, the government has to pay Lebanon's share of the tribunal's budget to investigate the assassination of former Prime Minister Rafik Hariri. Now, coming back to the book itself, it's impossible to think of Lebanon after the Cedar Revolution without examining the legacy of Rafik Hariri, the country's super patron who took on all the other contenders to become the country's foremost politician until killed by a massive car bomb in the city he literally made his own. A towering figure in post-Civil War Lebanon, Hariri's contested legacy ranged from revered to reviled. Revered as the savior of the nation and reviled as the destroyer of Beirut's cultural heritage. A city so complex that, as Hashim Sarkis has pointed out, it can only be summed up by repeating its name as in Beirut, oh Beirut. This book includes several chapters on Hariri's legacy by young, talented scholars, beginning with an analysis of the symbolism of the Muhammad Al-Amin Mosque that Hariri bequeathed and now towers over the Martyrs Square, the country's most iconic public space. Another chapter uses class analysis to explain the rise of the new contractor bourgeoisie, especially as it applies to Rafik Hariri and the current Prime Minister Najib Mikati, who both converted economic fortunes to political careers. A third chapter analyzes the neoliberal housing market and shows how it was exploited to expel urban squatters and bulldoze popular neighborhoods, in the process erasing parts of the country's Civil War history. The Civil War is finished, but as one chapter shows, a one chapter on Lebanon's post-war memory industry shows, in spite of a thriving memory culture industry, a recent survey indicates that 85% of the Lebanese have not reconciled with one another. Two of the most interesting chapters are written by AUB professors and today's panelists, Nasser Yassin and Sari Hanafi. Nasser Yassin's analysis of urban sociality in Greater Beirut details the complex sectarian mingling of youth sharing public space but not intimate relations, creating an impersonal coexistence without empathy. Sari Hanafi's chapter deals with the contested Palestinian refugee camps, which suffer from twin governance failures, a state policy of exclusion, and internally a lack of democratic institutions that make camp dwellers hostage to factional infighting. The final chapter examines one of the biggest challenges to peaceful coexistence in recent years, namely the international criminal prosecution of Hariri's murder, the Special Tribunal for Lebanon. A tribunal so special that there is nothing like it. A tribunal for one man, essentially. After 8 years of UN-led investigations, millions of dollars spent, and 400 staff members working in The Hague headquarters, the tribunal indicted 4 men, all of them Hezbollah members, who have neither been apprehended nor extradited. Was this costly process in both human and economic terms worth it? And what about the tribunal's deterrence? In October 2012, another martyr was added to the long list of slain victims when intelligence chief Issam al-Hassan was killed by a car bomb in East Beirut. This again put the country on edge, with angry calls for overthrowing the government and with potential spillover from the Syrian crisis. What's next for Lebanon? Another round of fighting? Tit-for-tat killings? New car bombs? Sectarian clashes in the contact zones between urban neighborhoods? Or angry youth fighting in the streets, no longer under the control of their leaders? And adding to this, there are new firebrand clerics like Sidon's Sheikh Asir, which indicates a stronger sectarian polarization that is beyond the control of traditional patrons and parties. Since we completed the book manuscript, the Syria crisis has reached new heights, with thousands displaced from Syria and entering Lebanon every day. This represents a major challenge to Lebanon and its policy of neutrality. So far, Lebanon has avoided being drawn into the Syrian conflict, yet can the spillover from the Syrian civil war ignite new conflict in Lebanon, or will the ghosts of the civil war prevent it? To follow up on these and other regional developments on Lebanon's recent and present history, I now turn to my friend and colleague, co-editor Michael Kerr.
Thank you, Harry. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah, good. First, thanks very much for coming and joining us to celebrate the launch of this book and taking time out of work and class. And thanks very much to Rami and to Issam Fares for hosting this event. We much appreciate it. And thank you also to Michael Young for joining us for this discussion. I'll say a few words about the significance of the book and the rationale behind it. And a few words about where Lebanon sits today amidst the increasing turmoil that the Middle East as a region is experiencing. I suppose it's probably fair to say that most commentators view the Tunisian uprising as the kernel and the origin of the wave of Arab revolts that have and revolutionary movements that have swept the region and challenged the Middle East state system today. In 2005, however, Lebanon experienced by far the largest popular revolt and counter-revolt probably that the Middle East has ever seen. Although it was far more opportunistic, strategic and timely than the spontaneous uprising that took place in Tunisia and spread quickly to Egypt and elsewhere. The shift in internal-external power relations in Lebanon had a number of significant catalysts, the most obvious being the assassination of Rafik Hariri on Valentine's Day 2005. This brought an abrupt and completely unscripted end to almost 30 years of Syrian military occupation and hegemonic control. And since the signing of the power-sharing agreement that ended Lebanon's civil war in 1989, for a moment appeared to free Lebanon. But these events, I would argue, should not be analysed in isolation, for they undoubtedly dented the hitherto unchallengeable image of Bashar al-Assad's regime. And if you think back to the pre-2000 period, no such loss of power or prestige happened under Hafez al-Assad's watch in Lebanon. So while Syria's military exit from Lebanon was remarkably peaceful by Middle Eastern standards, the fallout from the end of Syrian rule has been bloody, destabilizing and consuming, resulting in war between Hezbollah and Israel, military clashes between Hezbollah again and the government or the state forces, conflict between the state and Islamist groups in Palestinian refugee camps, prolonged bouts of governmental instability, high-profile political assassination, and most recently Lebanon is being incrementally drawn into the web of conflict engulfing its neighbour in Syria and in Lebanon itself, according to this morning's news. This conflict poses a great threat for Lebanon, for if we remember back and we reflect back over the last 30 years, if the Syrian state collapses, then the only power in the region that has been able to control, regulate, contain political violence and civil war in Lebanon will be replaced by an entity that it will probably be as weak, divided, manipulated and unstable as Iraq is today. Circumstances also which would almost certainly draw in Lebanon's other neighbour, Israel, as it has done in the past, with particularly disastrous consequences for both states. While 2005 is the focal point of this multi- and interdisciplinary analyses of Lebanon presented in this book, with much attention, as my colleague Ari said, paid to Rafik Hariri himself, the impact of his assassination and his legacy. It situates post-2005 political developments in Lebanon in its contemporary historical context and in readings of both the regional and international politics that continue to be particularly salient to domestic Lebanese politics and shape and influence this deeply divided society. For my own contribution, I trace the origins of the present crisis in Lebanon and the Arab revolts back a little further than 2005 to the unprecedented US-led military invasion of Iraq in 2003. Simply because an intervention of the sort that the US took in the Middle East was deeply unpopular, highly unsuccessful, and deeply damaging to itself and Iraq. This should not blind us to the historical significance of the incident. The 2003 invasion arguably cracked or began to break the mould of the Arab state system that in the eyes of the Arab street had hitherto been monolithic. Therefore, I would argue that its significance in historical terms will be no less than that of the Iranian Revolution in 1979, as it shattered the notion of the infallible authoritarian Arab state. The impact of this, of course, was felt first in Lebanon. But that is not something that we should be surprised by at all. For Lebanon, since gaining its independence through a national pact premised on the seesaw of neutrality in an unstable region, has proved to be something of a barometer of political tension and change in this region. And the events of 2005 were clearly a portent of things to come. Today, Lebanon is, of course, not sailing in uncharted waters. Post-2005 Lebanon is revisiting its very recent past. the politics of the civil war, and the inability of the Lebanese to disentangle or insulate their state in any significant way from Arab power struggles involving the Gulf states and Syria, and closely connected to international conflicts involving the US, Israel, Turkey, Iran, Russia, and others. We are witnessing a similar pattern of events then in Lebanon that arguably led to civil war in the late 60s and early 70s. That's not to say that I'm making the argument that Lebanon is on the path to civil war. But when the National Pact, already weakened and outdated due to its domestic rigidness and the disproportionate power structures, crumbled under the erosion of sovereignty, and that Lebanon suffered during the rise of the PLO as a non-state actor in Lebanon in the late 60s and early 70s. Yet the oddity of Lebanon is that the outcome of these conflicts, while they may bring different patrons, power brokers and international sponsors, which may see Lebanon either gain a degree or lose a degree of its sovereignty, the outcome, if contemporary history is anything to go by, is somewhat more predictable than what will happen in Syria or Iraq, countries that have no history or culture of power sharing or pluralism, or in the Gulf, should one or two of the Arab monarchies give in to popular revolt. We know exactly what form of government Lebanon will have. Lebanon's revolt against Syria in 2005 was an attempt by some Lebanese to take advantage of favourable exogenous international variables in the wake of the 2003 invasion of Iraq to regain a degree of sovereignty while the opportunity presented itself, and to take a step backwards towards self-government and independence, which is not something that Lebanon has experienced in recent memory. This is the opposite of what is happening across the region in the so-called Arab Spring. Although there are other states in the Middle East that have managed to maintain the same form of government since gaining independence, Lebanon is pretty unique. It is comparable perhaps to Israel in that it is a deeply divided, contested society, but it is one that has endured through its military prowess and the extension of firm and consistent support from the United States, which is something Lebanon has obviously lacked. Lebanon is unique in that the bedrock of its political system, power sharing between its different deeply ethnicized communities, remains the only show in town, a system of pluralism that predates the mandate period itself. And from the outside, it is easy to understand why commentators may view Lebanon as an ungovernable, fractured, civil war-prone state. But given its geographic location and its geostrategic importance, the survival of this very Lebanese system, of this pluralist system, is all the more remarkable in the Cold War period and beyond. Close Syria watchers may be looking at events across the country and marvelling at just how successful former Syrian President Hafez al-Assad was in building a coup-proof state, because it hasn't just collapsed as many predicted it would. A coup-proof state, which was surely his intention given the history of Syria as a coup-prone state from independence until the very moment when Hafez al-Assad himself took power. Equally, Lebanon watchers may perhaps conclude that its founding fathers, certainly inadvertently and through pluralism, rather than repression and dictatorship, established what we might think of as a revolution-proof state. But the old question of whether Lebanon can survive the winds of change that are sweeping the Middle East remains. Our hope with this book is that it will at least help you address that question and hopefully provide some answers to it. So in conclusion, this is the question, because Lebanon remains an unconsolidated state, but no more so than most of its neighbours. But while there remains great conflict over the nature of the state and its role in regional politics, constitutionally it should be neutral. There is broad agreement on the form of government that it should have, which again is quite unique. But there can be no doubt also that the coming years hold great dangers for Lebanon. Recent history has shown very clearly that there can be broad agreement amongst a majority of the Lebanese communities, yet they can be utterly powerless to enact agreements that they may reach, change or significantly influence regional events in in the midst of sweeping turmoil in the region. For example, the main constitutional changes that brought an end to civil war in Lebanon in 1989 through the Taif Agreement were agreed on paper between many of Lebanon's traditional elites in 1976 in the constitutional document, but it went nowhere until 1989. Moreover, the end of the civil war saw Lebanon lose its sovereignty rather than gain it for a further 15 years, albeit rather peaceably, under Syrian rule. Thus, the stakes for Lebanon in the post-2005 period could not be higher. Thank you. Nasser.
Yeah.
This one as well?
This one, yeah. Okay, good evening. I'm going to, is that all right? I'm going to take you to more the streets of Beirut from the macro trip that Are and Michael took us looking at the national and regional context that we are in. My book chapter is titled Sects and the City. So that was an attempt to look at the relationship, the intimate relationship of different sectarian communities, in particular the use of various sects in Beirut, how they interact. As Ari mentioned, there's no intimacy. Maybe perhaps there are levels of intimacy, and this is what I want to explore in this paper. If you walk in the streets of Hamra and you look at the youth of Beirut, they do interact. If you go to the campus here on AUB campus, you see different youth. You will never spot them if they are Christian, Muslim, Shia, or Sunni for most of the times. If you go to the mall, if you go to the Lebanese University, if you go to the Corniche, I don't think we have a city that is divided as some people might conceptualize it as a divided city. I think it's even more complex than this. And the level of social interaction and social relation among the youth of Beirut is even more complex, and to a very large degree it's paradoxical in the way the youth of Beirut interact and deal in their social relations. And I looked through a number of focus groups as this complexity or these paradoxes that conceptualize this relation between the youth of Beirut. And I looked at three angles. The first is the level of social trust. And here I find that the levels of trust are really very much compartmentalized. So I can have a friend that's a colleague that can be from a different sect. I can have a student friend or encounter that I can study with on campus who's from a different sectarian background. And I can have maybe we're both bartenders in the same bar, although we come from various sectarian backgrounds. But then when it comes to really the level of social trust, here we can question that trust does not really exist between, I mean the levels of trust at the level of all of Lebanon and the communities in Lebanon is very low. But then it comes even more unique here, the low levels of trust when it comes to people from different sectarian backgrounds. I have some stories in the book. I don't want to spend much time, but when we interviewed these youth, we did these focus groups, we really looked and pressed them why certain youth don't really trust youngsters or their colleagues from another sect. And we had this mostly related the way they were raised is different from us. And one guy from a certain sect was telling us that he has friends from different sects. They go for a drink, they go on campus, and so on and so forth. Yet he feels a bit anxious to get this friend into his home. And when we asked him, why is that? I mean, why? I mean, he's your colleague. You go for a drink and everything. And he said, I don't trust to keep this guy with my mom, with my sister. He comes from a different sectarian background. The way he's raised maybe is different. And these are all imagined. And these are all symbolic boundaries that the youth actually construct between them and others. So this is the first level that I looked in the book. The second level is of this compartmentalization is the discourses, the stereotypes that they use in terms of portraying the others. When we ask them, how do you actually describe your friend or others from a different sect? And you get the lot of how you see the others, the whole negative view of the others. I can read, they are dirty, they're sexually frustrated, they have no taste in life, they are disgusting, fanatic, terrorists, backstabbers, have no God, and so on and so forth. And when we ask them about actually how do you imagine yourselves as men and women from this sect, and here comes all the glorification of our group. We're generous, we're brave men, we're at the forefront of any battle, we're united, we're zealous, and so on and so forth. We're educated, we're clean, we're civilized, we're great breed. And all of these are actually imagined at the same time. I mean, you would never actually go and test the cleanliness of the house of a different sect, or actually if it's dirty or clean, or the way they think about these issues is not tested. But these are all imagined, and they're part of this cognitive categorization of how I see ourselves, how we see ourselves, and how we see the others. And this is actually is seen maybe on TV, is seen on the whole popular culture we look around us. And the third level of this actually compartmentalization is what comes to mixed marriages. And we rarely had young men and women agreeing on mixed marriages. So, I mean, this is a young man, this is a young woman who's in university, who's actually lives in a quite liberal life, in terms of the everyday life of this person. But when it comes to mixed marriages, this is a no-go area. So we asked why, and then we had a lot of these stereotypes come about the others, but also more importantly that they do not expect that this person will live the way we live ourselves. So I cannot get this girl, even if I date her from a different sectarian background, to drink alcohol in front of my father who's a Hajj. And these are things about how we construct, again, these boundaries between ourselves as people from a certain sect and people from another sect. So all these compartmentalization of social relations is actually building more and more symbolic boundaries between different youth from different sectarian backgrounds. When we discuss further with these youth about how they use space, so this is now more about the social relations, the everyday life, the socialization process, and understanding its complexity. Also, we found or we established the same complexities in the using of space. So we can go anywhere in Beirut, and this is a fact for the everyday thing we do. So I can go to Dahi even if I'm a certain sect and I see Dahi as a place with a certain identity to maybe buy some fruits and vegetables because it's cheaper there. So there is a way that youth look at these neighborhoods depending on the use of these spaces. Or I can go to Jummaizi even if I'm Muslim, or to Mar Khail and have a drink, or I can come to Hamra. So there is no actually division, or there is no really physical boundaries on the way we use space. We pushed further those, we pressed them further, and we asked about where do you prefer to live then? And here also we found a bit of this territorialization on the way we look at our places of residence. Most of them, not all, saw that actually living in a place where you have more homogeneity is actually their preference. And this has to do also with the aspect of feeling more at ease within your homogeneous neighborhood. And some even mentioned issues of security and safety, that they would feel more safe and more secure when they live in a neighborhood where there is a homogeneous group, come a conflict or a violence that erupts. So actually, just to conclude, that these are boundaries that are drawn mostly symbolically, but also at the level of space when it comes to the use of it, but not in the very clear, demarcated way. I always face this discussion when some colleagues come. I mean, I was living in London, I had this discussion, but also colleagues coming from abroad about how Beirut is divided. Is there actually the green line? Is it like very clear, or is really now Shia and Sunni are actually living between them? And I explained that this is even more complex than you can see or you can imagine. It's not like Belfast in a way, but it's not now anymore. But there is this symbolic boundaries that I'm talking about. So just to conclude, I mean, what transpires that here from this, that we see them live behind this superficial normality. So although it looks normal, but yet it's superficial when it comes to certain levels of social relation or places of residence. And what I would say in one phrase that would sum up the lives of these Lebanese youths, they're living really in paradox. They're torn between two worlds. One, on the one hand, they mix with others, they value diversity, they like the city, etc. On the other hand, and at equal strength, they have this tendency to be held in socially, politically, and spatially confined milieux at certain times of the life of the city. So things are not always in a constant. I think we have to see it in this dynamic nature. So just to conclude now with this electoral law, I don't know how things would read now. This was happened. We did this research 3 years ago or 2 years ago. So I don't know now if this would even entrench this idea of building symbolic boundaries between us and them. Thank you.
Well, I think, yes, actually the image I used in the title of my chapter is Conquer with the last thought you brought here, and the electoral role. And the title is Enclaves and Fortress, Archipelago, Violence and Governance in Lebanon Palestinian Refugee Camps. So I'm talking about specifically Palestinian refugee camps, but I see more and more a sort of Lebanon create enclaves and a sort of each community goes into a gated fortress and things like that. So I start my my chapter by citing Hannah Arendt that I quote, "No doubt this development of violence has a logic of its own, but it is a logic that springs from experience and not from the development of ideas." So this is I quote Hannah Arendt to say, if there is erupted extreme violence inside the Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon, it's not because it's a result of Islamist or jihadist militant ideology from the specific political and or social cause, but rather of the gloomy and dread living condition that give rise to the cause, and second, to the lack of legitimate governance structures in the camps that has prevented the improvement of living condition of the Palestinians. So, in fact, the whole paper, I invest many statistics I got from Palestinian human rights organizations, in addition of international information, who did a fantastic survey in Palestinian refugee camps around 2010. So, and simply I realized that first is camps which have the image of insecurity islands. Juzur Amni is neither more violence nor less violent than any Lebanese locality. I mean, I cite international information. There is 700 homicides in Lebanon in 2009. Some of them politically motivated. So I think in that year, you have only 12 Palestinian killed by violence inside the camp. So the percentage is very few. So I am not saying all violence is homicides. Of course, we can find other form of violence. So I found, I looked to statistics, I aggregate the violence between first social violence, I mean domestic violence, gender violence, but Palestinian political faction violence. But this is, I found it, is not really the most important form of violence in the camps. The most important form is the violence with Lebanese army, with the ISF internal security forces. It means the violence happened in the checkpoint. So I question. So for me, the whole issue of violence. To address it, we should address what I call the militarized violence, the state governmental violence. Of course, there is, in the paper, I explained twin failure of governance from popular Palestinian popular committees, and with Issam Fares Institute, we did a huge work on this. We criticized a lot what is going on the camps. Here today, I wanted to focus about that if you want to reduce the violence in the camps, you think the type of governance the Lebanese government should do for the camps. So state governmental control is characterized not by the enforcement of well-defined rules and laws, but by the suspension of these rules through the skewed bureaucratic apparatus. Is very important in Lebanon, the bureaucracy. It's not true, it's the image of rule of law, etc., that impose different modes of intervention whose very unpredictability is the key of its effectiveness. The intervention takes the form of real or suspended violence. Some researchers, for instance, and human rights activists were arrested in 2010 because of their criticism of Lebanese army roles in governing the Nahr al-Barid camps. And other activists reported staying away from his home in Nahr al-Barid for more than 3 months because for fear of being arrested by the Lebanese army. So militarized camps governance is based on two principles: nominal inclusion of the camps under Lebanese sovereignty, so it's not true that the camps outside of the Lebanese sovereignty, with a simultaneous geographical exclusion. The inclusion is institutionalized by discrimination, especially through the 2010 law on the right to work, for the first time Palestinian namely excluded from the work, for Palestinian refugees, and the 2001 ruling that curtailed their access to property ownership. The material outcome of separation and its twin pillars of legal prosecution and enclave geography create a deep sense of spatial exclusion and endemic disorientation for Lebanese and Palestinian alike. I don't have time to develop the Lebanese disorientation in this regard. So my research focused in Ain al-Hilwi, and I met with all those illegal groups, Jund al-Sham, Fath al-Islam, etc., or something like that. So it's clear that that many of them look for a solution, but Lebanon authority don't want to find solution for them. So the question is not they are ideologically bound to be violent and to be outlawed. My last message to say that the book is called Lebanon After the Cedar Revolution. I would say the Palestinian in Lebanon is an old story with no serious solution offered to them, provide to them, neither before nor during nor after Cedar Revolution. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to thank the Issam Fares Institute for inviting me to this. Not having been part of this project, I wasn't quite sure what to say. So I decided maybe what I would try to do is look back at the last 8 years since 2005, and in a way draw the salient messages or that at least I've seen, and the transformation. If I could just say one thing, Ari, if you will allow me. I actually do cover the post in my book, the post-2005. No book would be that interesting just covering 2005. But so as I said, the salient messages, and I should add to that the frustrations that were engendered by the post-2005 period. Like many people, I lived through this period and discovered through the changes in my own outlook that it is difficult to find anything that's really constant, reassuringly constant in this period. What we saw were the transformations of political actors, their shifts, and adaptability in pursuit of self-interest. And this has been in many ways very interesting and very revealing. The first thing I would like to say perhaps about 2005, something that is really morally inescapable, but that now and then tends to be forgotten, is that it began with a crime. I think given the divisions in Lebanon in the post-war period, we've tended not to focus enough on the fact that a crime occurred. At the time, many Lebanese saw the assassination of Hariri as an outrage, an insult to their sense of what was right, and they acted accordingly, in the same way as people in Tunisia reacted to the self-immolation of Mohammed Bouazizi, or the people of Daraa responded to the torture of the young children by Syria's intelligence services. This is, I think, an important point to repeat. It's obvious that it was a crime and that it was a contemptible crime, but also that this crime became a source of considerable discord in the post-2005 period. Hariri's partisans insisted on the fact that he was a victim of this crime and that it was up to Lebanon to create a situation where there would no longer be any impunity for those responsible for such crimes. The opponents replied, yes, it was a crime, but almost immediately emptied this of a great deal of its content when they argued, well, why should Hariri be the only person who benefited from an international investigation and a tribunal? And they went on to say that Lebanon would suffer from an investigation that was not the fruit of a national consensus. But this broad disagreement on this very simple notion of how do you deal with a crime was at the heart of Lebanon's political divisions after 2005. And if we today we find ourselves in a rather different situation. This was at the core of Lebanese disputes at the time. Today, Hariri has, in a sense, almost receded from the scene. We tend to forget that on the 14th of February, it was the 8th anniversary of his assassination. There was no commemoration, largely because his son is not in the country. But it was distinct, we could very clearly see that this was a very different phenomenon than what we saw in 2006, 2007. Perhaps because Lebanon today is facing a number of serious problems, new problems of its own, and given the fact that the society today is there is a great fear that the society may, in a way, move towards conflict, particularly between the Sunni and Shia communities. There is no real enthusiasm to go in the direction of playing up what happened in 2005. Yet I think there is an irony here that opposition to crime writ large was the impulse that led many Arab societies in the last 2 years to revolt against the political orders in place, from Tunisia to Egypt, from Libya to Syria. And it sparked, of course, what happened in Lebanon, which I prefer to call the independence intifada. I don't think that the notion of Cedar Revolution is accurate. I don't think there was any revolution in Lebanon in 2005. What took place was very much a reflection of the realities of Lebanese society. Cedar Revolution, of course, was a term that was coined by an American official, Paula Dobriansky. She's a very nice woman, but I don't think she's a specialist on Lebanon. Instead, Hariri's assassination led to an assault on the system of control and intimidation that had been imposed by the Syrians with their Lebanese allies for decades. For me, this is the second most salient message from 2005. What we had, and which we cannot deny today, was a felicitous removal of a security apparatus that had done much damage to Lebanon, to its constitutional institutions and continuity, to the economy, and much more. Syria had allies in Lebanon, but I think very few by 2005 could defend the Syrian system as beneficial anymore to Lebanon. And this rejection of the instruments of repression, primarily those exercised by Syria's ubiquitous intelligence network, only presaged what we would see in the Arab world beginning in 2011, which many, if not most, Arab societies viewed with great sympathy. In Lebanon's case, the pushback was only partial, I believe, because Syria did manage to leave behind very powerful allies. I refer, of course, to Hezbollah, but also I would add to that the Lebanese Army Intelligence Service, which itself has had, I think, very ambiguous loyalties over the years. And they were never held accountable for what had been done at the time of the Syrian presence. Instead, the Lebanese would emerge from this period with a certain schizophrenia. One part of the political spectrum condemned the continued presence of a major instrument of Syrian influence, namely Hezbollah, while the other affirmed that Hezbollah embodied a resistance ideal in which the alliance with Syria held a special place. The problems emerging from this disconnect plague Lebanon to this day in the divisions between March 8th and March 14th, and with the Syrian conflict making this even more complex, more divisive. A third observation I would make on the period of 2005, as I said earlier, is that all talk of a revolution, to my mind, was empty. As any of those who followed the details of the period January to April 2005 recall, there was no impotence of the political leadership at the time to permit a challenge to their authority. And the March 14, 2005 demonstration, which was, to my mind, one of the great events in modern Lebanese history, nonetheless came very much from a confessional impetus. It was not the birth of a new Lebanon. It was very much a monumental representation of an old Lebanon. Largely because I believe people were mobilized in response to the 8th of March demonstration by Hezbollah. And I was at the 14th of March demonstration, so I'm not, but it's very, I think this is important to realize, this very, very simple reality. And yet, let me add that the political leadership in 2005, if you recall at the time there was a message or something that had come out of that, the idea that a new Lebanon was being born, in which confessional relations finally were being thrown to the wind, sectarianism was no longer part of it, and yet I remind you that the people who participated on the March 14th and during that period, in the end, all followed their political leaders. And when the elections came, the society was as divided as it had been before. My own views of sectarianism are a bit complex. I believe that it's one of the things, sectarianism has allowed Lebanon to be a pluralistic society, paradoxically. And this has created spaces for liberal action, although sectarianism in itself is far from being a liberal system. But this, in a way, this is what I think has allowed the leaders, again, time and again, to reassert their will when it comes to political action in Lebanon. I think if there is one thing I've learned, is that the sectarian leaders managed to keep in 2005 a tight rein on developments and played on sectarian tension to enhance their own agendas. But it's also why we shouldn't hasten in a wave of middle-class self-righteousness to write off the sectarian leaders. They will retain influence and weight, particularly in so unstable a country as Lebanon. And these leaders were instrumental in carrying their interactions into the post-February, April period of 2005, and in that way taking the initiative out of the hands of those who went down to Martyrs Square with much more idealistic goals. Not surprisingly, what would ensue was a prolonged period of political conflict as Syria sought to reimpose itself in Lebanon with the help of its Lebanese allies, and as those in March 14th sought in turn to consolidate their grip over a post-Syria Lebanon. These dynamics led to growing divisions within society, most dangerously, I think we can agree, the Sunni-Shia tensions, which we've seen in the country, and whose continued shocks make us anxious even today. The core of this dispute was the kind of Lebanon to which the different parties aspired. For March 14th, it was a country in which there would no longer have to be coexistence with an armed group like Hezbollah, particularly after the war of 2006. For Hezbollah, in turn, on March 8th, it was a Lebanon that could pursue the resistance path. Somewhat in the middle, because I don't believe he is an March 8th figure, is Michel Aoun, who saw in his alliance with Hezbollah something that would advance his own political agenda, principally to become, he hoped to become president, but also to become the paramount Christian leader in Lebanon. Now, these dynamics fed into regional dynamics, characterized principally by the Saudi-Iranian rivalry, which in turn exacerbated the successive crises in Lebanon, as both countries relied on their local allies and backed them up in domestic battles. And this led to another one of the great reversals of 2005, namely the effort by Saudi Arabia to effect a reconciliation between Saad Hariri and Syria, the price of which would have been Hariri's denunciation of the Special Tribunal for Lebanon. This process broke down in early 2001, partly because the US opposed it, and it precipitated ultimately the ouster of Saad al-Hariri in 2011, who had never been particularly enthusiastic with this process anyway, but who had to follow it because his patron was imposing it on him. So in early 2011, we witnessed an effort to draw a line through the crime of 2005, a step that would facilitate the return of Syrian influence over Lebanon, and this came in the context of a Saudi effort to consolidate Hariri's role in Lebanon and break Syria away from Iran. Yet all this ultimately did was worsen Sunni-Shia relations following the indictment in the Hariri assassination of 4 Hezbollah members. The Saudi effort, as you know, failed, and what we have been living since then is the aftermath of this breakdown. Soon thereafter, the Syrian conflict started, which has only made worse the relationships between the communities in Lebanon, particularly a Hariri-dominated Sunni community and a Hezbollah-dominated Shia community. To this, we can add yet another ingredient, which I think has actually destabilized the political system much more than people are willing to admit. The departure in April 2011 of Hariri from Lebanon, which has left, I think, a rather significant vacuum in the Sunni community. Hariri essentially left the ground to his political adversaries. And this corresponded to the formation of Najib Miati's government, the same Najib Miati, you'll recall, who took over from Omar Karami in 2005, in a moment that was seen by Hariri as a major advantage to him. So the ironies of this reversal could not be underestimated. I think you see where I'm leading. The post-2005 period has been one in which Lebanon obviously has been politically divided, but also in which many of the political positions, or the stated political positions of the political actors, were soon contradicted by their behavior. So if I could just remind you a little bit, we have Hariri, whose primary self-stated objective in 2005 was to uncover the truth about his father's assassination, who advanced for a time in a Saudi-sponsored project that would have undermined this effort. We have Hezbollah, which in 2006 said that it was at the vanguard of defending Lebanon, and which in May 2008 turned its guns against fellow Lebanese after saying it would never do so and overran western Beirut. We have Walid Jumblat, who was instrumental in mobilizing opposition to Syria in 2004-2005, who reversed himself in 2009 and began shifting towards Damascus until his reconciliation with Bashar al-Assad in March 2010. The first public sign of this intention, to my mind, if you recall, was this telephone video of him speaking to Druze elders, in which he described the Maronites, if I recall, as jins hatil. He had insulted the Maronites. I think that this was a message that Jumblat was sending to the Syrians prior to the 2009 elections, saying, I'm willing to move. And finally, we have Michel Aoun, who destroyed half of Lebanon in pursuit of his war of liberation against Syria in 1989, and who played a key role in the independence intifada of 2005, who returned to Lebanon in 2005 to ally himself with Syria and its allies and argue against all evidence that Syria was no longer politically present or relevant in Lebanon. For the idealist of 2005, the cynical maneuverability was an embodiment of the vanity of their own hopes during the independence intifada, of the ability of our political class to abandon moral imperatives with nimbleness and then persuade their followers that this was acceptable and to follow them. And yet, in reading Lebanon after the Cedar Revolution, otherwise the most interesting book I found, I was struck though how little room was devoted to a very simple concept, that of the emotions propelling events in 2005, to what it was people were in fact rallying against, which would later explain what took place in many Arab countries a few years later. And yet emotion, no matter how much we might mock such an impulse when discussing politics, at least in an academic framework, is often an impulse that drives historical action. In hindsight, I'm not sure that many Lebanese today, looking back on 2005, would look back on it free of cynicism and without a foolish feeling that they were played by their leaders, foolish for having been caught up in the heat of the moment emotionally. And yet for me, what remains strongest from that time is the sheer power that came out of that moment, the feeling that anything was possible when the gates of popular outrage were opened, and for once a large number of Lebanese were able to act together in unison. As we look back on 2005, that might be the one thing which we can survey with sympathy, for it showed the Lebanese system in a rare moment of absolute power and triumph against great odds, which momentarily, alas only momentarily, seemed to offer an alternative to all those things collaborating to stifle change. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all of the speakers. If I may just add a personal note, I was here in 2005, and my office was just down in Gemezi, so I was going every day, twice a day, to all the demonstrations. Whoever was demonstrating, I would go and watch it. It was my job as a journalist. But I suspect that the link between the independence intifada in Lebanon and the uprisings that we're seeing around the region wasn't mainly seen in the independence intifada, the rallies against Assad. It was in the 6 months before, when you had some very brave and patriotic Lebanese speaking out against the extension of President Lahoud's term by the Syrians. That struck me when that was going on in September 9th, the second half of 2004, and people were writing openly and speaking openly, people like Samir Asir and others, some people who paid with their lives. That, to me, was the genesis of the public rebellion against Lebanon being dominated by Syria or by anybody else. And then, of course, what we saw when Hariri was killed, and the others who were killed with him and the others who were killed after him, was this mass public explosion. But you could see that the common spirit of rural Tunisia and peri-urban Cairo and southern Syria and central Beirut was this breaking the barrier of fear. And that started to happen at the end of 2004. And I think it's important historically to go back and put that process together to understand how these sentiments were mounting in the hearts and minds of people, and some were brave enough to go out and say them. So thank you for those comments, and we'll open it up now for questions and comments. We have a microphone, so wait till it gets to you, because this is being taped. It'll be put on our website. And try to make very short comments or questions so we have time for all the panelists to respond, and identify yourself, please.
My question is for Dr. Kerr. You've said that the system in Lebanon is unique. Would that be positive or negative? And just that most of the writers have talked about the state itself and the system as an adequate arrangement for the society in Lebanon, and that the breakdown of the state in 1975 was due to exogenous factors, whether PLO or the Syrian actually going into Lebanon. So what would your opinion be about it? Would be the system itself is adequate and positive, or would it be that the continuous external intervention is what makes it on the verge of breaking down every crisis?
Thanks. I was listening to and agreed with what Michael said about the positives and negatives of the sectarian system. And I mean, quite frankly, I think it's a miracle that Lebanon survived the 20th century intact. But but you could make the same point that it's a miracle that Lebanon has been at the sort of brink of civil war a number of times since 2005. But some sort of cynics might argue that the brink of civil war at certain points after 2005 was the best place Lebanon could be, holding back from that. The question of whether it's the system, that's a difficult one, and it is a difficult question. It's an important question, and it's one that could be addressed with respect to Lebanon at various different junctures within its history, be it in 1958, 69 with the Cairo Agreement, 75, 89. But the model has actually been taken from Lebanon and adopted successfully elsewhere in the world. I mean, I'm from Northern Ireland, and the last book I published before this was on Northern Ireland in the 1970s, and I discovered that whenever the British government prorogued or suspended the Northern Ireland Parliament, ending Unionist majority rule in 1972, they got the idea of power sharing. It wasn't the only influence. They'd been looking at Belgium and Switzerland as well, but a couple of MI6 officers or intelligence workers officers that were seconded to Northern Ireland in 72 had cut their teeth in Lebanon in the 60s and came back with this bright idea that might work and that was before the Lebanese Civil War began. Now, of course, it didn't work in Northern Ireland in the early 70s, but it is working today. And the reason why it's working so well today in Northern Ireland is because Northern Ireland is buffered by, it has stanchions of exogenous, positive, external support, British and Irish and American governments working with a unity of purpose to deliver, sustain, implement and police a power sharing agreement, not in their own selfish strategic or economic interests, but as an interest in and of itself, above and beyond their own domestic or national interests. So they learnt the lesson of that from the early 70s. But with respect to Lebanon, I mean, we can't even really answer that question because the Taif Agreement has not been implemented. The Taif Agreement, the dereliction of the Taif Agreement after 1989-1990 is well known, to the discourse on this subject. Now, you might say an opportunity was presented to Lebanon at Taif to, claw back some of its sovereignty and perhaps, implement a better power sharing system, a power sharing system that might have moved away from the sort of corporate clientelistic ties of patronage between the Zioms and the allocation of ministerial seats and responsibilities. But this, of course, did not happen. It happened for Syrian reasons, because the troika of Reni Mawad, Salim Hoss and Hussein Husseini, who were strong traditional leaders, were put out very quickly, and pro-Syrian figures came in, but also because the exogenous support that allowed Taif to happen in Saudi Arabia disappeared, because Syria aligned itself with the United States in the anti-Saddam front in the Gulf War, which saw all the promises of money and support for Lebanon dry up as all attention in the region focused on Kuwait. To conclude on that point about the system, I asked the US ambassador to Lebanon at the time, why did the United States not pressure the Syrian government to implement the Taif Accord? And he shrugged his shoulders and said to me, the Lebanese government never asked us to. But the Lebanese government wasn't the Lebanese government anymore, it was the Lebanese government via Damascus. So I would say it's not the system, but the Lebanese system needs to move from, I think the Lebanese system is going backwards. It's becoming more corporate. The sectarian law that's being discussed at the minute is a major step to consolidate that corporate power sharing, and I think that would be a grave mistake. How it will move forward in the future towards a more liberal consociational formula, I don't know.
I have a question for Michael Young. In late 2006, you wrote what I thought was a brilliant article. I think it was following the Israeli incursion, and was based on the overwhelming, I mean, virtually total support of Hezbollah by the Shiite community. You said you weren't sure whether this was one country or two. I wonder whether your thoughts have evolved since then, whether you have an answer for us now.
Well, I think the simplest way to answer that question is ask ourselves, is this one country? And I don't think we will be able to answer yes, unfortunately. I think coming back to this Orthodox law, it's a good example of where we are today. I think the Orthodox law is very clearly an effort to say there are many separate components of this country. I don't know. I mean, I agree with what Michael was saying. I think that Lebanon has stepped backwards. Today, Lebanon is not at a good place in terms of its historical development. The notion of one Lebanon under the sun, so to speak, is, I'm afraid, simply not there. The calculations of the political leaders are primarily based on the interests of their sect, even their sect across the border in Syria, or I can say this as much about Hariri or Jumblat as I can say this about Hassan Nasrallah. Even young Lebanese, what is the prospect for them? They don't seem, I mean, this is very anecdotal, but the ones I see are not particularly hopeful in the future. I'm not seeing that this is a Lebanon. Ironically, there was much more of a sense of Lebanon, at least during the war years. It seemed that at least all this mess had to lead us somewhere, and the somewhere was, well, a post-war Lebanon, which very naturally would reflect pre-war Lebanon. I'm not seeing this today. I'm just not seeing this. I think your chapter was very interesting for precisely this reason. What you see is that people are thinking in very atomized terms. So I don't think we've seen a Lebanon since 2006. I wonder if we really saw it in 2005.
I'm interested to hear from anyone on the panel why and how you think Lebanon has held together, specifically over the past 2 years, considering that what we've repeatedly called spillover from Syria is actually, I think Lebanon is already, all sides are very deeply involved next door. So I'm interested also to hear whether you quantify or codify any of that in your research or academic studies, this phenomenon of Lebanon always sort of pulling back from the brink over the past couple of years?
I can respond to that following up in agreement with what Michael just said, and maybe to put a slightly more optimistic spin on it. I mean, if you look at what happened in Iraq after 2003, you saw the Iraqi identity that had been, carved out, or with an iron fist by Saddam Hussein, fall to pieces. After the Lebanese civil war, the conflict over whether the state itself should actually exist is long over. And the conflict, I would argue as well, over whether Lebanon should be a Western state or a resistant vanguard state on the front line in the Arab-Israeli Israeli-Iranian conflict, is also becoming outdated because of the Arab Spring. I mean, we may be sitting here in a year's time asking ourselves, what is the political function of Hezbollah? So whilst the Lebanese are divided and old war divisions have taken on new forms in the post-2005 period, compared to other Arab states in the region, the Lebanese identify more with their state than they do with their religion. If you ask an Iraqi, what am I? They will probably say a Shia, a Kurd. If you ask a Lebanese, they'll say I'm a Lebanese. And, mind your own business if you ask me my religion. I mean, obviously, people wear their religion on their skin, as they would do in there's ethnic markers that are obvious in all deeply divided societies. But there is a sense of a syncretistic, overarching Lebanese identity that exists, and I think it has been consolidated by the civil war to an extent. But the state itself is not consolidated because the Lebanese have not invested the political capital that they have within what is a corporate power-sharing system in a centralized Lebanon, central state.
Of course, the simple and traditional answer to this is, of course, that Lebanon experienced a civil war and wouldn't like to fight another one. And now in Lebanon, you can look over the border and see the Syrian civil war unfolding. And to me, at least as a foreigner, it looks remarkably, some of the pictures you see, they look remarkably as the pictures you would see from the civil war, with people in the streets fighting. So I cannot say I have any sort of clear idea why Lebanon should or should not end up in a new conflict. It could. I think, though, what I tried to say in the introduction, that there are the international community, UN, of course, all the countries who have an influence in Lebanon, means that Lebanon will not so easily and quickly maybe fall into a conflict. But there will, of course, be continuing and low-intensity conflict, which there is. And this is probably what makes it stressful to live in Lebanon, that you have this uncertainty that something is going to happen. And probably something will happen. But again, the kind of traditional view is that having experienced a civil war, Lebanon wouldn't like to fight a new one. But this could change. Of course, a worst-case scenario, something along what Michael discussed, is that there is a scenario, some acts, some type of conflict that makes it impossible to stop. So you will have a kind of conflict dynamics as you had in the start of the 1975 Civil War. But I see that as less likely now, of course, than at that time. Just would like to mention very briefly, since I have the word, that I think it's very interesting what Michael Young said about the fact that the 2005 Intifada, not Cedar Revolution, I agree on that's a bad term, but it was nice for our book. It's strange that the murder of Hariri, which started all this, seemed to have receded. I don't live in Lebanon, and I came here first time after 2005 in April. And already then it felt that I had hoped to catch some of this feeling, this intensity, and the emotions that you say. But even then I didn't feel them that strongly when I went down to Martyrs Square. And it's quite strange, really, that coming back over the years, I felt that when you drive through Hamra, the Hariri posters are becoming bigger and bigger, like they're saying, "Don't forget me." And it's also an irony, I think, as Michael Young was also mentioning, that the special tribunal now is almost like a liability. It's sitting up there in The Hague, it's spending a lot of money, but it seems to be very, very little interest in what it might find, and a lesson maybe to people who advocate transitional justice. It might have just exaggerated conflict. I think I'll stop with one final observation I read in one of Michael's columns, which I think is interesting. Of course, transitional justice teaches us that it's extremely important for societies to deal with war crimes. There should be tribunals, there should be justice for the victims, and so on. But in one of his columns, Michael Young wrote that he thinks that the strength of the Lebanese is the ability to forget. The ability to forget the atrocities of the civil war is the strength of the Lebanese people. I'm not sure if he believes that today, but at least it's a strange twist on the importance of transitional justice, which most professionals advocate, and think Lebanon, without it, since you didn't have it, are more prone to enter into a new conflict. Thank you.
I agree. I think one thing, there is a tendency in Lebanon to say there was this officially sanctioned amnesia in the post-war period. Well, there was at the state level, but I don't think society ever fell back into amnesia on the war, and I agree. I think this is the big obstacle. Would it go all the way? Would it succeed in blocking any war? I hope so. I'm not sure. But of course, one of the big things that is condemned in Lebanon is the amnesty law of 1991, And I remember once I was speaking with a friend of mine by the name of Paul Ashar, who at the time was representing the families of the disappeared. And Paul said something to the effect, it stuck with me, and I actually thought he had a point. He said, well, you know, the amnesty law was a good thing. Of course, it was a Syrian-imposed thing. We know very well what was the objective. How could you build a post-war order without some kind of law like that? But his point was, for the state to function, it had to quickly circumvent this whole issue of wartime guilt and wartime crimes. And unfortunately, I'm afraid over the years I've tended to agree with this view, because you're not going to arrive at a middle ground in interpretation of the war in Lebanon. It will always be a source almost uniquely of division, of divisiveness. And I don't think we're going to arrive at a consensual. So in that context, the idea of going back and trying to find, you know, a truth commission is, I think, something destined to fail. And the alternative to that is something like the amnesty law, which, as I said, no one will defend, but in a way, it has a certain value, as I think we should think about before we dismiss it.
Well, Michael, the issue is not 0-1 blanket amnesty or put in trial everyone. I mean, the problem in Lebanon, this is to make a blanket amnesty, not only that, and to leave all the warlords to keep them to govern this country. So the scale of the amnesty is terrible. And now in Ari referred to transitional justice now as a discipline. We know that always a blanket amnesty lead to disaster. And even I would say the blanket amnesty in Chile, what is very interesting, that the society resisted and the judges refused to apply this amnesty. Here, the contrary, the judge who are, some of them also warlords, I mean, they are so happy to reinforce this blanket amnesty. So the scale, the lack of lustration, administrative justice, I mean, to kick all these people out of their political position, I mean, I think this is what we witness now, that the same people who waged this war, they still here and without any impunity.
Had you gone up to the arrest Walid Jumla, this would have happened easily. Or had you gone up to arrest, I don't know, I mean, we can name dozens, Nabih Birri. What would the results have been? Unfortunately, I agree with you in principle, but I don't think in practical fact, given the divisions in Lebanese society, this was a feasible outcome. I'm sorry to say.
If I can just throw in an observation from a non-Lebanese who has lived here 3 times in his life and now calls it home. My impression is, and I was here at the beginning of the Civil War, my impression is that the reason the country is held together and has not slipped back into civil war is very simple. The Lebanese had a civil war, and they realized that it didn't solve anything. Everybody suffered. They also realized that if they have another civil war, nobody's going to care from outside. Nobody's going to come and do anything. They'll let them just destroy each other. Third of all, Hezbollah is so strong that you can't really have a civil war. And therefore, they realize that they're not going to go back to it. They've had many chances in the last 7-8 years to slip back into sectarian fighting on a big scale, and they've always pulled back, sometimes with external Saudi, Syrian, Iranian, whatever, intervention to help them, and sometimes just on their own. The parallel part of that, which to me helps explain how Lebanese politics works, is that the fundamental characteristic of Lebanese national politics is perpetual, high-level, very professional brinksmanship. They're constantly on the brink of a major catastrophe, a major disagreement internally on any subject. salaries of the public sector, electricity, voting laws, any subject that comes up, there's a major national clash of political ideologies, and they bring parliament to a halt, and they go on strike, and now we're seeing so, and then they pull back from the brink just when it looks like they might get into a civil war. This strikes me as a formula that has worked for the Lebanese, but it comes at great long-term cost because the national debt continues to rise, the best young people leave the country. So there's a huge cost to this kind of perpetual brinksmanship, but it's something that the Lebanese people themselves are going to have to decide.
Nora Bustani, Michael Kerr said Lebanon has been constantly on the brink of civil war since 2005. The reasons for civil war have been changing with each crisis. You know, it's no longer Christian-Muslim. Is it Shiite Sunni? Is it Lebanon doesn't see itself as a vanguard state? And now with Syria in such turmoil, Lebanon's identity crisis is going to shift again. My question to you is, I'm as schizophrenic about these reasons for possible civil war as any Lebanese, and I certainly don't have any answers. But my question to you is, do you think that the Lebanese are stepping back from the brink? It's not only because they don't want to go through another civil war, but because of this culture of greed and, you know, big buildings and 5 restaurants in every alley. I mean, doesn't that have anything to do with it?
Yes, I mean, I think the answer to that question will to be outside the hands of the Lebanese, and I totally agree with with Rami's analysis with what he has just said, and I think the most difficult thing is to come, and it is going to come quite soon, because, well, and it's unclear when it will come and how long it will last. It's not, nobody can predict exactly what's going to happen in Syria, but if Hezbollah and Iran, if the troika between sort of Hezbollah, Damascus, Tehran is broken, and Hezbollah's Arab sponsor disappears, then the thin veil of resistance is going to be transparent without Syrian support. So Hezbollah, who have been in a difficult position with the other Lebanese communities and partners in government over recent years, are going to be at a crossroads, whether they are Lebanese or whether they are a driver in the Arab-Israeli conflict of Iranian foreign policy. Now, what Rami has said and what has happened over the course of the last 8 years, and Hezbollah's pragmatism since the end of the Lebanese civil war, would lead you to think that, or might lead us to think that they will find a way out and find a way in, and the international community and the Lebanese should allow them to find a way in and invest in the state when that time comes. But it will be a very delicate and prolonged and controversial process with many ups and downs. But there can't be a Lebanese state, without the Shia community and the Shia community's representatives. Yes, but they don't exercise Lebanon's foreign policy. There's a. I mean, there isn't a consensus amongst communities and within cabinet on whether, for example, Hezbollah should be participating in the conflict that's taking place across the border. And as reports came in this morning, it seems that Hezbollah positions have been hit inside Lebanon and inside Syria. So this is, but. Whilst if we make a fairly crass comparison and look at the PLO situation in the early 70s, the PLO were coming from outside. They were not going to Lebanize or become Lebanese. Hezbollah are from inside, and they are constitutionally, spiritually, economically, militarily backed by Iran, and Syria was the sort of linchpin in that relationship, the controller. If that changes, as I said, Hezbollah are going to have to take a decision. You know, their future is in Lebanon, and things are changing in the region, and you cannot look at this outside Israeli foreign policy either. Israel's primary objective in Lebanon, its central interest, is peace on its northern, and stability and securing its northern border. If there's two fronts with the Golan Heights, then Lebanon is in deep trouble. And we know what has happened in the recent past, and we know what happened in the 70s and early 80s. So it's up to the international community and up to the Lebanese to stay at the brink and hope, as has happened in the past, that positive exogenous forces, factors, enable them to maintain the status quo. Because I think that's the best thing Lebanon can do, and that's the best that we can expect Lebanon to do.
Just a very brief comment to what was said by panelists from Northern Ireland. I also read the newspaper this morning, and I read about weapons coming through Lebanon, through Syria, this free Syrian army. I don't know who's facilitating that, just as another part of Lebanese foreign policy. My question is actually to what you said earlier about you observe increased national identity in this country. I've been here now 5.5 years, I'm ambassador of Denmark, and I'm very surprised about what you say. This is not what I encounter when I get around in Lebanese society. First, I've never been to any country where they're playing the national anthem so often as they do in this country. I see this as a very desperate attempt to create an illusion about national identity. Each and every meeting I go to, we have to stand up for a few minutes and listen to this beautiful anthem, by the way. But I don't see that necessarily as a serious indicator of national identity. I see the opposite. I hear when I ask people what they are Greek Orthodox, they're Sunnis, they're Shiites, they are from various sects. Let me give you one very specific example. Denmark has been funding for a number of years summer camps for young people, not only from Lebanon, but also from other parts of the region, Palestine, Syria, Jordan, and other countries. And one of the exercises that we asked them to do is these groups, national groups, to identify symbols of the country they belong to. It's interesting to observe that the Lebanese group has very serious problems identifying one common symbol of the country they belong to. So I'm curious to know the substance, the evidence of what you said when you talk about increased national identity to this country.
Thank you. I mean, I don't mean to overstate the point, but I think where I was drawing those remarks from is that, unlike many other states in the region, where there has been long been or is, opposition movements that are militant or who are challenging the government, they are seeking radical constitutional change, and in many cases, you just have to look at the borders of Kurdistan, they don't recognise the state. Now, Lebanon was premised on negating two different national identities, Greater Syrian nationalism and Christian separatism, and they opted for a larger state. And now the debates, without going over them, that debate seems to me to be completely over. And I think the debate about whether Lebanon should be a vanguard state or a Western state is ephemeral, and it will shift, and Lebanon will go back to its old shape. But the change will be is that all the communities, whilst I completely agree with you, at the minute and at salient points of conflict, that everyone goes back to their tribe, they all want to live together apart in Lebanon. So I wasn't saying there's a strong sense of national identity, like, but there's a syncretistic, a rather elastic, overarching identity. I thought what you said about symbols is very interesting. Somebody should write a paper on that or a dissertation. But I do think that exists. But of course, unlike you, I don't live here. So the Lebanese I meet every day are strangers I meet in Lebanon. And like the Northern Irish, if you take them out of Northern Ireland, they all get on like a house on fire in somebody else's capital.
Anybody who hasn't asked a question?
I just have a question for Mr. Young. You mentioned that Sari Hariri's departure left somewhat of a vacuum in Lebanese society, and I agree, and I think a lot would agree that this vacuum led to a rise in Islamic fundamentalism within the Sunni community. You've recently written about not giving in to men in black. I wonder what you think about this rise in Islamic radicalism, and do you think it's here to stay? Will it hold strong? And what does that mean not only for Hezbollah, but also for the presence of what I hope is a growing secular liberal youth? And that brings me to another question to Dr. Yassin. Don't you think that the recent activism surrounding the civil marriage law puts more hope for the youth in Lebanon? And don't you think there's a big section of youth which demonstrated last February for a secular regime in Lebanon, trying to take advantage of the Arab Spring? Don't you think it's a large segment of the youth that is marginalized or not really being given a lot of attention?
Okay. I think there are segments of the youth that are more secular and liberal than others. I mean, that's true, and this has been the case since at the end of the war. Maybe you're all young, but I was at university at that time, and we were very active in this front. But this group of the youth is I think getting smaller with time. And maybe the attempt now by the civil marriage of these two brave couple, I think this may create some precedent. So you may see some change. And here you need those brave game changers who can really go there, and maybe they would encourage other youth. But yes, I agree. I mean, there are segments of the youth. But I want to add that, and to the ambassador, that looking at the identity and looking how the youth look at their other youth from other sectarian background, how they see their own identity, how Lebanese see their own identity is a dynamic, elastic thing that we have to keep in mind. I mean, there's no constant Lebanese, there's no constant Sunni, there's no constant Hariri, there's no constant Hezbollah, these things are always changing, and they depend on multiple factors, and they depend on context they are in. So maybe at certain times now they are more sectarian than before, but these things could change, and this is maybe an optimistic look at the identity, like any other identity, but here it comes with a package of maybe a bit of violence, a bit of conflict, a bit of tension, but you see multiple identities everywhere, neighborhoods, football clubs, and so on. And I think if you see it this way and you try to contain it and manage it and contribute to this management of these different identities, maybe we can coexist at this stage. And coexist is okay now, but it could improve in the future.
I think the question was, do I think that the radicalism, the impact of it, this is a good question, because I've often we speak about, for example, Sunni Islamist groups as being the big threat, and I'm no fan of any religious extremist group anywhere. But I think it's often overstated. And at the same time, by saying this, you want to be careful, because that doesn't mean that these groups are not capable of creating major problems. Ahmed al-Asir is an example. This is not just a phenomenon that is passing through that will disappear, I think. I think Asir, first of all, let's remember, he's in a significant place. He's on, quote unquote, the front line with the Shia community. When he decides to do something in Saida, obviously it has an impact on the Shia community, on Hezbollah. These groups, I don't believe that these groups speak to a fundamental radicalization maybe in Lebanese society. I think that's a bit overstated. But that doesn't mean that these groups cannot, why don't we go to the extreme, cannot start a war because it doesn't take much to start a war. It doesn't take much to provoke violence that will lead to worse violence and so on and so forth. So, for example, a few years ago, I went to Tripoli because I was interested in looking at the Salafist groups in Tripoli. I wasn't impressed. These were not impressive groups. I mean, the people, I went into Beirut Tebene. What was the concern of the young people of Beirut Tebene? It was basically to find a system where they could get money, because the issue is poverty. There is an issue of poverty that we have to look at in Lebanon, in a lot of these urban areas, which of course gives these groups an impetus that they would perhaps not otherwise have. You mentioned Hariri's departure. It has created spaces. Hariri is not here. So other groups say, well, we're better able to address the challenge of Hezbollah, which somehow gets turned around into a challenge of the Shia. The situation in Syria is another example, something that is given a new impetus because we now see a much more sectarian war taking place there than perhaps 2 years ago. All these, I think, are dangers to watch out for. It doesn't necessarily mean that Lebanese society is growing more radical. I think a vast, again, I'm not a sociologist, so I don't know what the figures are, but from what I see around me, I think a vast majority of people want to avoid a war. A vast majority of people want to avoid something that could lead to a war. But that doesn't mean that groups cannot, will not. And Rami, if I can say one thing, I disagree with you. Hezbollah's strength is not just a source of stability. I think a lot of groups today, of the smaller Sunni groups, believe that Hezbollah can be defeated, that a war against Hezbollah can succeed. I'm not one of those who believes that if there is a civil war in Lebanon, that Hezbollah would win. I think everyone would lose. It would be a disaster. And I think there are groups who feel that they could come out on top. So it's not radicalization per se that worries me. It's the fact that a radical group may create a dynamics that will lead to conflict. This is what disturbs me, or what worries me.
Unfortunately, the Salafist group in Tripoli, those who did ethnography of this city, flourished when a future movement gave them money for electoral reason. It's amazing how a future movement with a short vision subsidize these people because they know this is the quick access to a Sunnite community, so I think again this secularism of future movement cannot be understood without also looking to all opportunistic stands and that is combined with this secularism. Yeah.
What would you consider the main impediment for achieving true democracy in Lebanon to be? Would that be sectarianism? And if so, do you think it has been constructed throughout the years? Or is it a summation of political leaders and the failing political institutions?
Thanks. I'll just refer to Rami's point about what Lebanese politicians do best. They create conflicts and pose themselves as the only solutions to them and engage in brinkmanship. What hasn't happened and what makes today's Lebanon unfortunately, I'm not old enough to remember, but rather different from pre-Civil War Lebanon, is there hasn't been an incremental state-building process since the end of the Civil War. Each community has kept it to its own, and it has become more fragmented. I mean, what works? I was having a shower this morning and the electricity went off. It's like, why? This is 2013. So which comes first, the perfect liberal democracy or the willingness to invest political capital into the existing state to change it? Now, I don't think anybody's going to do that whenever the game of musical chairs is speeding up and the music is getting faster, and it is getting faster because of what's going on next door. But in the future, that's what Lebanon needs to do. It needs to move towards a more liberal form of power sharing, a more proportional representation, move away from the designation by sect as of right of position X, Y, and Z. And liberal democracies in theory, or liberal consociations in theory, are meritocracies as well. So parties have to win their seats in government on electoral mandates, not just on sectarian headcounts. And so I think there's been a general consensus on the panel that Lebanon is still going backwards, away from the steps forward in state building. And of course there were plenty of problems before the Civil War. I'm not trying to paint a rosy picture of the 60s, but it is definitely going backwards. But to go back to my original point, this country has the same constitution and the same constitution beneath the constitution, if that's how you see the National Pact or the Taif Accords. The bedrock, the cornerstone of the state remains intact, and I think the Middle East is facing the most unpredictable and period of change since the Iranian Revolution. And I think Lebanon will survive that. But it's one thing I thought was rather sad. I've mentioned a couple of the statistics. I came here just before the Israel-Hezbollah conflict and saw some opinion polls that Professor Theodore Hanf had just produced. And with the exception of Hassan Nasrallah, all the traditional Lebanese warlords and leaders, their ratings in the opinion polls were rock bottom. But after the conflict, they all went, everybody's gone back to their tribe in times of deep insecurity. So I think state building, investing in the state, thinking of Lebanon, maybe not first, but equal to your own community. But Lebanon lacks political parties as well. It also lacks local government at the minute, and the sectarian law would exacerbate this very bad problem. The central government appoints local governors and local administration. So the sectarian law would reinforce and copper fasten that system of clientelism and patronage. And again, that's moving away from liberal power sharing or liberal consociation. Where I come from, the First Minister is the leader of the largest party, and the Deputy First Minister, the second largest party, and one is Protestant and one is Catholic, but they're elected together. So if one resigns or falls, the other goes with them, and they both have identical power. So they are linked together in the cabinet, and they can't help but try and find a consensus. But on a related point, the state already exists before the power sharing system comes into play after 1998. So the civil service, the security services, housing, health, it already exists. It's not carved up between different factions. Protestants and Catholics had to invest their political capital and take engage in processes of constructive ambiguity over their ideologies. One negating the right to unite Ireland by force of arms as of right, and the other, Protestants, majority rule. So there's a state for them to step into and share power easily within. Lebanon lacks that, and it also lacks the external patrons to help them do that. Lebanon usually gets hobbled at critical junctures in its rebuilding process in efforts to regain sovereignty, in attempts to consolidate new agreements based on old foundations. And sadly, I just don't think that's going to change in the short to medium term.
Concerning the impact of the Cedar Revolution on Lebanon, not too long ago, the Minister of Culture, Gabi Layoun, refused to mention the word Cedar Revolution when writing the history of Lebanon. To what extent do you think this is a rightful decision? And can we actually reject the existence of such a revolution? Thank you.
Well, I am a sociologist like that I use the vocabulary that chosen by actors. First, if the actors call it Cedar, why we should change the name first? And if they call it revolution, why not? So the issue is not labeling. The issue to see, and this is what Michael Young described, and Rami somehow, to say, look, it was a huge demonstration. Maybe the most important demonstration in the history of the Arab, if you like, demonstration. But nevertheless, do they do this? These demonstrations mount into a social movement. It means a claim of change. They have a project. And they have identity. Those who gathered in the downtown, and they know who is their enemy. Myself, I did what in French we call sociological intervention sociologique. It's a sociological methodology. You go in the ground. I went where you have the camp, independent camp. I talk with actors. I spend 3-4 days. And it's clear, for instance, that there is no unified claims. Lebanese forces tent in that time, they want me first liberating Jaja. And the Communist Party, for instance, they have other claims. And in the end, if you like, the major issue like secularism, what would you do with sectarian system? It was unthinkable issue for all these huge demonstrations. So this is okay. So I don't mind to we call it Cedar Revolution, but you show limitation of use this word.
Any final comments, short comments from the panelists, please?
Okay, I just want to come back to a question about these radical groups. I think there is this twin development. There are new radical groups like Sheikh Yassin, and also on the Shia side. So I think the interesting development is a double one. You have traditional parties who lose control with their members to some degree. And one reason, which already Michael Young mentioned, they are out of the country. It's difficult to run a party if you have to rely on Twitter messages from abroad. And this is what Hariri is doing. So I think one reason that we have these new groups coming up is also that traditional party has been losing initiative, and I also think that they have not been able to renew themselves. It's not so easy to see what they are battling for. Just make a quick point on the state. I think, picking up again what Michael talked about, yes, these groups are all trying to compete for the state or set up their own state, something like Hezbollah tries, or what they try also in Tripoli. So the state is still critically important, and everyone wants a stake in it. And if they can't, they try to make their own. The last point, I think, about the state, I don't know if you've heard about Michelle Obeid, an anthropologist. She has written 2 very interesting articles from Arsal, a village which is now, of course, everyone knows, a big problem with the Lebanese army. And she writes that sitting up in Arsal, when you look down, you feel that the state is just a punisher, and same the army. It's not giving anything. The state is a punisher that takes something. I think it's a big problem with the Lebanese state is that it's not providing electricity, so Michael cannot take a shower. and a whole lot of other things. So although the country is held together, the state is basically seen as something that takes away. This, of course, is more strongly felt if you live up in Arsal and if you live in Hamra. I just want to add one final point. The positive, and on a positive note, an interesting and positive development is that Lebanon had 150,000 people dead in the civil war. Today, the homicide rate is very, very low. It's on par with Finland, in fact. I don't know if the ambassador knew. So it's very, very low. So the positive thing that you can come out of a civil war, you didn't do any transitional justice, you have a very low homicide rate. One thing that sets Lebanon apart from a lot of countries is the very high number of political assassinations. And this seems to be something that people in Lebanon accept as a given. And so far, except from Hariri, we don't know really who did it, why, and that we don't know, probably never going to be punished. So I don't know if it was on a happy note, but at least, thank you.
I noticed that one thing we haven't discussed here is this very interesting period, 1990 to 2005. I mean, I think we have to, the Lebanese tendency is often to blame others for their problem, or in this discussion, we've tended to focus on our own shortcomings. But I think it's important, we should remember. This
is working.
It's coming back, it's come back. So, but I think it's very important to bear in mind that there was a presence. The Syrian presence in Lebanon was never going to end without leaving a long impact on the society, whether in terms of constitutional decision-making, in terms of Ta'if. Michael, you raised Ta'if. But one reason Ta'if was never implemented is partly that the main external actor never wanted to implement it. He implemented it selectively. I mean, the Syrian presence was not a small thing in terms of modern Lebanese history, and it's not going to change soon. I think when we talk about the Palestinian issue that Sari discussed, again, the Syrian presence, the Lebanese can be blamed on many things, but this was not independent also of the Syrian presence as well, which played on a number of factors. I think in all of the discussions we've dealt with here, there is this unmentioned. It's that you do have the Syrian factor, which has left an impact, which we have to deal with. Political assassinations is a good example. That's not to say the Lebanese are innocent, far from it. But you cannot not deal with this external factor that has been quite significant, I think.
Just to agree with my colleagues here that yes, we're going backward on many fronts. I recall during the Civil War, I was as a kid, but at that time we had trade unions who were actually active across the divide in Beirut. That's something we tend to see now a bit with some secular and independent trade unions. The youth during the 90s at AUB used to vote non-sectarian whatsoever. We had 2 or 3 lists to vote for. Now we see more of this sectarian, and you see now even at the West Hall we have a division between the 2 camps. But I think there are some positive aspects, to end on a positive note. I think the trade unions now, the movement we see, I think is going across the sectarian divides, which is something we should look at positively, maybe we should encourage. And this recent youth movement about the civil marriage, I think if we do a breakthrough here, is something positive. At the end of the day, Lebanon is so small that even the main news at 8 p.m. covers some small incident of 2 people fighting in a family in north of Akkar or in Baalbek or something that comes to be in national news. So this is also to see it positively. Any positive news can also spread so positively and can have some wider impact on the society. When the rumor was going that Saad al-Hariri will send his private jet to get those pilgrims, Shia pilgrims from Syria, you see a positive mood across Beirut, everywhere. That was a rumor, that wasn't the case, but you see, I mean, even a very small story about a private jet of Saad al-Hariri picking some Shia pilgrims who were kidnapped created a positive mood. So we have to keep some positive aspect in looking at Beirut, looking at Lebanon, so let's keep some optimism about this.
This brings us to the end of our panel discussion. I want to thank Atallah Salim, my colleague at Issam Fares Institute, for doing a lot of work to put this together. Thank the panelists and thank you all for coming. Thank you.